We are.
All rise for the jury.
Dr. Fonseca, please come forward.
I'm sorry, Ron, I didn't hear you.
Be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for the delay in starting today. We appreciate your patience. Dr. Fonseca, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
I do. Good morning, Your Honor.
Mr. Nurmi, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Fonseca.
Good morning, Mr. Nurmi. Good morning.
Yesterday, Doctor, we were talking about a series of emails contained in Exhibit 561. And we heard the responses of Mr. and Mrs. Hughes to Travis's initial email, correct?
Yes.
And ultimately in 561, Travis also responded to Mr. Hughes as well, did he not?
Yes.
Okay. And what I want to do as we talk about these emails is I want to be so kind. I know it's a long email here, but let's talk about the response Mr. Alexander sent to Mr. Hughes. If you could begin by reading that this morning.
I want to understand, this is the response that Mr. Alexander had to Mr. Hughes of crossing the line. My apologies.
Right.
Okay.
After Chris and Sky responded,
Yes.
Travis responded.
Okay. Chris, well said. I will start at the end. You are already forgiven. This is how I saw things going, and I appreciate you doing what was right. This email you wrote was the one I was hoping for. I wrote Sky earlier and told her that I knew your intentions. Your reasons combined with your perspective makes sense. I think he meant sense. I obviously didn't like it, but I understood it and did from the...
Give me a moment, Doctor.
No problem. From the beginning, I knew you weren't out to get me. Honestly, most of my passion over it came from the same source yours did, ironic as it is. It broke my heart to hear sweet Jodi crying over the weekend experience. Just like she is with me, she doesn't want to upset you and Sky. She was in an environment that allowed her to easily vent on me, and she did. And then I don't think she was prepared for the response with such severe actions, but took it silently, just as she has with me. Then, just as she did with you, she came to me crying. Just as she did with her, I got upset. I wasn't upset with about the loyalty issue or anything like that. She is a person with feelings and a heart just like me, and she was vulnerable and still is. Let me clean about somewhere I am. 7 years of loving someone and wanting it to work and watching it not of me is hard in and itself. But in addition to that, I have took the life of someone and not only gutted them, but also took the best 7 years of her life and let her waste it on me. She could have gotten married 100 different times, but she didn't because of me. Now, because of her age and the dynamics in the church, her chances of having marriage to the type of person she deserves has been so greatly diminished that I can hardly live with myself. What if she lives a life with no love, no family, or even worse, is forced to marry a piece of crap because of me? It was more than I can bear. She doesn't deserve it. With people like Brandy, I'm a bit of a sociopath. she'll be fine and move on, so I don't lose a lot of sleep over it. But what I have done to Deanne is unpardonable. I have felt over the past couple of years that I am her only shot of getting her the life that she deserves, but my quote-unquote block concerning marrying her has not gone away, and I have only made matters much worse. In the past year, we went from boyfriend to girlfriend, to close friends, to acquaintances, to only speaking when it is absolutely necessary. She owes me money type of stuff, which is about 5 minutes every week and a half or so. I still love her and in some way probably always will, but for sure will always hurt her and feel guilty. I have truly hurt her and nearly destroyed the one I love the most. I don't know what to do. I am good at finding solutions, but I haven't found one for this. I know she is in pain right now. When she calls, okay? No problem. I'm going to take the opportunity to get myself some water while you're doing that.
Counsel, could you approach for a moment, please?
Doctor, if you'll be so kind. Bear with us a bit, and maybe what we'll do here, we can make it a little bigger, and then what we're going to do is have you slow down a little bit when you read it, okay?
Yes, sir.
We'll go in smaller sections so I can magnify it as much as we can here. All right, I believe we were at the word when she calls.
When she calls, I act like I don't care, and I'm very surface with her. I can tell it tears her apart, and it's all I can do not to cry on the phone. There is 2 reasons I do this. The first is for her. I hate to hurt her, and in the process it hurts me, but I know it's even worse to lead her on, so the best I can do is act like kind of acquaintance. She hasn't said it in a while, but when she says I love you on the phone, I haven't built the courage to diss her on that. Fortunately, she hasn't done that for a while. This is what I believe Sky is referring to as unavailable, and she is right. 7 years I have known her. Many of those years I was either certain I would marry her or at least thought I would eventually come around. We are so close that 2 Halloweens ago we played the newlywed game with a bunch of prepaid legal associates and that had been married 2 to 5 years, and we won the game easily. I feel like I divorced someone and that I still loved and had no big problems with.
Okay, let me pause there, Doctor. Then I'll
Yes.
move it up.
Thank you.
Make sure we can get it all in there and see it well enough, Doctor.
Yes, sir.
Okay, starting with someone, please.
Someone I have tons of fun with, someone I was happy with, in fact, someone I know I would be happy with forever. It is a unique and a torturous experience to dissolve things that I am solely to blame. Now to Jodi. I have always liked Jodi. She looks good on paper. In fact, to be shallow, she looks good, period. But we both know there is a lot more to her. She is amazing. It is hard to see that whoever scores Jodi, whether it be me or someone else, is going to win the wife lotto. I have not let myself get too emotionally attached because I respected her more than the others, but me not getting emotionally attached didn't stop her from getting that way. Well, having Jodi adore you for any period of time is hard to resist. It wasn't until after I had an awakening while dating that one girl that 86'd me and that I had a paradigm shift. I told her not to expect a lot from me, but she continued to pursue me, and honestly, I have let the walls down a little. Simultaneously, I have been going through this extremely hurtful experience with Deanna. But the more I have been able to separate myself from Deanna, the more room I have been able to give myself to Jodi. Now I am far from where I need to be for Jodi, and that has everything to do with the Deanna thing, and it is killing me. But I have made progress, and I hope that progress continues. However, I still don't think it's fair to Jodi to wait around for me, even though it's only been 4 months. I have encouraged her to go date other members to ensure that she is not in love with what I have done for her, also known aka share with her the gospel, instead of being in love with me. Let's face it, any other guy she dates is going to be drastically different than me, which will either be good or bad. However, the jackass non-member who asked her to toss the church and then the 45-year-old bald Jew are not my idea of eligible bachelors. I didn't think...
Again, indulge me, Dr. Lemieux. Get it up there.
Thank you. I didn't like the associations or their approach, and so I was about as forthright about those guys as you were about me. Honestly, though I wasn't jealous, I would be plenty jealous if a good Mormon boy, because they have potential of taking her away, but I don't deserve to have my cake and eat it too, which is a hard pill to swallow and uncharacteristically unselfish of me. The fact that I have real feelings for her and have made some progress is both scary and stressful for me, but progress nonetheless. So when she called me no longer sounding like loving Jodi, but like a crying, sad version of Sky, I guess the timing couldn't have been worse. I was exponentially upset. Jodi has a major timid streak in her, and sometimes loving her ways are so extreme that she walks on her toes with everyone when she could just have talked things out with me. And because she didn't tell me, she told you, and when she didn't get the advice she was hoping, rather than tell you, she came back to me. I have kindly told her, and let me emphasize kindly, that she could express any of her feelings or concerns she has for me, for you, or Sky, with who it is relevant to. She is genuinely concerned by something that was said, that neither of you would have respect for her if she spoke to me, which put her in what she felt was the pickle of a lifetime. I think she feels better about that now, and I have been 100% honest about the Deanna thing with her. And I've also tried to work on her issues with me, and she promised that she would be upfront and honest with me if she has an issue or feels like she is a victim of the T-Dog. That is my best I got for her right now, with a desire to be more available. This is the farthest I've come in many years, and it's still far from where I need to be, and I can't promise anyone anything except I'm trying. It's probably not the best effort, but relative to me, it's pretty good. That's where I am now. Time will tell. If you want to recommend a good guy for her, be my guest. It will suck, but maybe it's for the best. I don't know if that means I'm sending mixed signals, but what I mean is if I am not ready to marry her, then she should be entitled to find someone else that is. I'm not the best guy in the world. I am a D-head with some pretty awesome redeeming qualities. I don't know if that qualifies me as a great catch or not. But once I get married, or at least I am to the point I think I will, be much better a catch. That's all I got for you. Good or bad, that's where I'm at. I'm not saying that it is good. I'm not saying that it is good enough for Jodi. In fact, it probably isn't. But that's where I'm at. I will finish where I began. There is no love loss. None. Zip. Zilch. Nada. Honestly, it's the kindest email chat we have ever had, which in my opinion shows that our friendship has gotten even stronger. Yes, you said what I deemed inappropriate, I told you. You responded apologetically and explained your motive. It made sense. I explained where I am and accept your apology. In my opinion, that's the end of it. Just make sure that Jodi feels comfortable around you guys. I don't think that will be hard. Talk to you soon, Travis.
Thank you, Doctor. I know that was long.
It was.
Doctor, this email, as someone who is providing an expert opinion on the analysis of the relationship, Would you characterize what you just read to the jury as Travis's sort of confession that what was being said about it was true?
Objection leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes, I think he's making admissions of some of his foibles.
And amongst those foibles, we hear about selfishness in relationships.
We do.
And he confesses to being a bit of a sociopath, his words, not a professional diagnosis again, right?
Not a professional diagnosis, only a self-admission.
A self-admission to being a sociopath with this girl named Brandy.
Yes.
And we also have, within the context of the same email, Mr. Alexander acknowledging or admitting that the T-Dog, Mr. Hyde, we called yesterday, has victims.
Yes. And you can see that also, that in the writing when he's talking about, if we could just go up a little.
Beyond the scope of the question.
Where can you see further evidence of that, Doctor?
In this email, when he talks about a sociopath, being a bit of a sociopath, and talks about, I'm not going to lose sleep over it in terms of what he did with.
Well, why don't we go to that section here?
Excuse me.
Okay, he's talking about this girl Brandy right here. Is this the section you're referring to?
Yes, when he says with people like Brandy, I'm a bit of a sociopath, and she'll be fine and move on, so I won't lose a lot of sleep over it. There's an admission there's an admission of him being a bit of a sociopath, but he's not going to lose sleep over it. Whoever this individual is, whatever it is that she did, whatever it is that he had done with her, he's not going to lose any sleep. But he admits that he's a sociopath, but I don't sense that I feel bad about that, I'm sorry. I don't hear that in this email with regard to this woman, other than I'm a bit of a sociopath and she'll be fine. And move on, so I don't lose a lot of sleep over it.
But he does, at the same time, he admits to having some regrets, I guess, about his conduct with Deanna Reed.
Oh, yes, it's clear that he's feeling guilty, remorseful, feeling bad about Miss Reed and his inability to commit to her for a marriage. And from his email, it sounds like he's carrying that.
And it also sounds like he still has love for Miss Reed while he's dating Jodi Arias.
And he clearly states that he loves Miss Reed.
Doctor, as it relates, I want to ask you some questions as it relates to the whole, all these emails as a whole, all right? Not specifically, but as a whole, okay?
When you're saying all these emails, you're talking about?
The ones we covered yesterday, we covered
Yes.
the ones in, and I'm sorry, I should have been more specific. Exhibit 560 and 561 we covered yesterday and again here today.
Yes, thank you.
Now, Doctor, a lot of what we saw here was a reaction to a conversation that Ms. Arias had with Scott Hughes and Chris Hughes, correct?
Yes.
And yesterday you told us about this voluminous amount of material you reviewed for preparation in this case. Do you recall that?
Oh, yes.
And one of the things you talked about was police reports and interviews that had been done with Ms. Arias.
Yes.
Police interviews, and you reviewed her testimony as well.
Yes.
The testimony of the prior hearing is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Okay. And you understand, based on her prior testimony and her interviews, and even on her prior testimony, I guess, that she has not always been truthful with what she said to the police and others in interviews.
That's correct.
How then as a professional, because I guess it could be argued, and my question is, it could be argued, well, all this is just based on a lie, so none of it means anything. Would you agree with that?
Objection, relevance, calls for legal conclusion, argument.
Approach, please.
Doctor, I want to step back a bit, okay?
All right, sir.
It's fair to say that throughout the course, and what we were talking about earlier, throughout the course of the trial, when she was arrested, that Miss Arias has been less than truthful, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
That she's out and out lied at times, hasn't she?
Yes.
As a professional, coming forward in this case, you come in with that understanding, having reviewed these materials, correct?
Oh, yes.
And in that regard, as a professional with 34 years of experience, is your opinion based on the word of someone solely, your opinion about these emails, or anything in this case, frankly, solely related to the words of a liar?
No.
What, Doctor, the opinions that you told us about in these emails, are they based on the words, solely on the words of Jodi Arias that instigated this email dialogue?
No.
The opinions that you're giving related to Exhibits 560 and 561, what are they based on?
They're based on with regard to 560 and 561?
Yes.
They're based on the writings of Mr. and Ms. Hughes, who primarily are not so much talking about Jodi, although they do talk about Miss Arias. The bulk of those emails are about Mr. Alexander, giving a historical perspective of Mr. Alexander, giving a historical perspective on Mr. Alexander and his treatment of women, historical perspective on Mr. Alexander being mean to girls, as Ms. Hughes said. So it wasn't based on what Jodi was saying, Miss Arias was saying. It was based on Mr. and Mrs. Hughes' observation of Mr. Alexander over a period of time. I think one of the emails said 5 years before Miss Arias came onto the scene. So they were giving a historical account of things that they have observed, things that they had seen with regard to how Mr. Alexander treated women, that he was abusive, that he was
Objection
mean.
beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
When they concluded, when they made the conclusion in the email that he was abusive to women and mean to girls and things that we just talked about, you're seeing the validity in that, not based on what Jodi Arias might have told Chris Scott Hughes on that day, but on this historical precedent, correct?
Objection asked and answered, leading.
Overruled.
Yes, I am basing it on what Mr. and Ms. Hughes giving a historical account about Mr. Alexander. And that, for me, further...
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
And what does that do for you?
Well, as you said earlier in the questioning about coming onto the case and seeing that Miss Arias had changed the story, so it would be foolish for me just to focus on what Miss Arias had to say, because Miss Arias had changed the story. So I really went out and worked in. By that I mean I used the state witnesses, Mr. Martinez's witnesses, that had testified, and there had not been a question about what they had reported. And so in going out and working myself in, when I found things that were corroborating or supporting what Miss Arias had to say, then I would move another step forward. But I started out and I worked in. And so for me just to focus on what Miss Arias had to say, it would be foolish for me to do that, because it's clear that she has changed the story. So I needed to move where there was not a change of stories with other individuals who were reporting things. So this is why the emails by Mr. and Mrs. Hughes was so important, because it gave a historical account, something that they had observed, something that they had a dialogue with Mr. Alexander about, and he did not appear to dispute what they were saying to him. So that gave credibility to the reports of Mr. Hughes and Ms. Hughes about Mr. Alexander, and then further corroborated some of the things that Ms. Arias was saying.
Objection, vouching, corroboration, what the defendant said.
Overruled.
And Doctor, in that regard, you mentioned Travis Alexander's email, his responses to all this dialogue. We just read one. At no point in time, and just specifically as it relates to whatever Ms. Arias told the Hugheses on that started this email chain. Okay?
Yes.
You understand what I'm talking about?
Yes, yes.
This conversation that was the source of it. Did at any time Mr. Alexander say, she's lying about this?
No, I did not see that in the email. I didn't see anything where Mr. Alexander was disputing or challenged what Ms. Arias was saying.
So when Ms. Hughes said about making out with her at night and calling her at 1 in the morning and ignoring her during the day, he didn't dispute that, did he?
He did not.
Asked and answered, invades the province of the jury. They can read.
Overruled.
Can we approach?
Yes, you may approach. Dr. Fonseca, when you hear an objection, if you would stop speaking until the court rules.
Yes,
Thank
Your Honor,
you.
I understand that. The only thing is, if they could speak up on the objections, that would be appreciated, because it's difficult to hear in the court.
I understand it is difficult
Thank
to
you.
hear and hear. There is a bit of an echo today.
Pardon me?
There is a bit of an echo today. I understand.
Okay,
That happens sometimes. All right, you may proceed.
thank you.
And Doctor, when Travis Alexander, Mr. Hughes brings up the idea of women being victims of the T-Dog, does he ever say, no, these women aren't victims of the T-Dog, I don't have victims?
Mr. Alexander does not deny that, dispute that, or challenge that.
And as a matter of fact, he echoes some of the same language, doesn't he, about gutting women?
He does.
And in fact, not only that, when you're analyzing this, formulating your opinion, is it relevant to you that even after Travis knows, Mr. Alexander knows everything that's in this conversation that he had with Chris and Scott Hughes, he says, let's face it, they don't get much more honest than Jodi?
Yes.
And that at least acknowledges as a sign to you that he is acknowledging everything, that whatever she told them is true, correct?
Objection, leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
He didn't dispute any of that.
And Doctor, as it relates to your analysis of these emails, Exhibit 560, 561, at the same time, you don't know exactly what Ms. Arias said to Chris and Scott Hughes, right?
I wasn't there, I have no idea, but it's clear that whatever it is that it's clear to me that whatever it is that she was talking with them
Objection
about.
beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
What is clear to you, Doctor?
What is clear is that whatever it is that Ms. Arias had reported to Mr. and Ms. Hughes, they responded with this whole historical reports of how he was being with women. So something was tied there in terms, for me, when I read that, in terms of what she had reported. Ms. Sky Hughes indicated in one of her emails that they know Travis. They've seen this before.
Now, Doctor, moving past the emails, these two emails in 560 and 561, or these two groups of emails, I should say. We talked a little yesterday about this idea of, I want to make sure we get your verbiage right, the intimacy deficits that both Mr. Alexander and Ms. Arias brought to this relationship.
Yes,
Is that the right words, intimacy deficits?
those are the words that I would use.
Okay. And one of the things that we talked about was the history that you knew about Mr. Alexander's upbringing.
Yes.
And we were talking about two different relationships and marriages and interspersing. So I want to just clarify, to your understanding, did Travis Alexander's parents stay together or did they divorce?
I was incorrect in my report yesterday. They were divorced.
And, Your Honor, if I may approach.
You may.
Doctor, I want to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 733. I don't want you to read the content or anything, but just tell us if you could recognize what is in here.
Yes.
And what is that without, again, describing that one?
It's Mr. Alexander writing some things about his childhood history and his family.
And do you know when that was written?
It's dated May the 5th, 2008.
And is that something you reviewed in formulating your opinion regarding this case?
I did.
Thank you, Doctor. Move to Exhibit 733.
Any objection?
No.
Exhibit 733 is admitted.
And Doctor, just to recall, this is a introduction to a book that Mr. Alexander authored, correct?
Yes.
I want to draw your attention to some of the things that were written in this introduction. There we go. Let me, I don't want to read all of it, but let me talk about this in the context of the love map and the deficits that you talk about. Could you begin with the sentence or the paragraph beginning at school and ending at I never came back?
School wasn't much better. When your clothes are as dirty as the rest of you and you stink and you have lice, you don't make a ton of friends. Sadly, you could imagine I was mocked for my appearance. Nothing too harsh, nowhere close to what was said at home. I will not give much detail on that as I feel it is inappropriate to state. I will say, though, I have never heard in any movie, on any street corner, or amongst the vilest of men, any string of words so offensive and hateful, said with such disgust as the words that my mother said to my sisters and I. I remember my mother emptying a revolver on a car my father was driving, and my father subsequently taking an axe to my mother's belongings and destroying them. I remember being on the other side of the front door when my father kicked it down. The police were called that time, along with many others, but I knew what had to be said and knew that they would leave us to more of the same. I remember the day I came to the conclusion there was a God. I was 6. I screamed as loud as I could all day long for my nearby grandmother to get me and take me for the weekend. I screamed so long and loud that I actually woke up my comatose mother long enough to beat me for waking her up. When she went back to bed, I went back to screaming God. Sure enough, that evening she came and picked me up while my mother slept. I could go on and tell you more of mine and worse stories of my siblings, but I think enough has been said. I will say that this is nothing at all compared to the whole of it. This continued until I was 10, when I ran away and I never came back.
Showing you what's been marked as exhibit 434. Zoom out a little bit. You recognize this photograph?
Yes, it's a picture of Miss Arias and Mr. Alexander at a, looks like at a formal dining. I think it's at the banquet, PPL banquets.
And given what we know about what we just read about Mr. Alexander's upbringing and this passage from his book introduction, he came a long way, didn't he?
Oh, yes. I would have to say that Mr. Alexander really picked himself up from the bootstraps, really. Became professionally successful, financially successful, bought a home, had a whole social system of friends. He traveled a long way, really, considering the things that he talked about in terms of being from a very neglectful home. So, yes.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because even when we see this picture, Doctor, from what you told us yesterday, and as someone who studied these intimacy deficits, that sometimes those places we come from and the descriptions we hear are something we just, even if we're wearing a tuxedo at a ball, there's still part of that with us, isn't it?
Oh, yes. That's part of their psychological makeup. It's not something, as I said yesterday, it's not something that you just take off the sweater and just walk away from. It leaves scars.
And Doctor, as someone, you know, when you read this about, for example, I've never heard, on any movie, any street corner, vilest of men, any string of words so offensive and hateful that my mother said to my sister and I. I mean, that's got to have an impact, right? When your main caretaker in your family is able to say these vile things to you. What do we learn from that? I mean, what do we learn about love and intimacy and our dynamic from that?
Well, Mr. Alexander, when he's talking about just what you had quoted about, I will say that I've never heard any movie or any street corner amongst the vilest of men a string of words so offensive and hateful, said with such disgust as those the words of my mother had said to my sisters and I. I mean, that sentence for me really wraps up that it was really very abusive, what he endured, what his sisters endured, what his siblings endured from a mother who had a drug problem, the beatings that he endured. So there were shining lights in Mr. Alexander's.
Well, let me interrupt.
I wanted to.
Because I want to ask you some questions about the imprint that leaves on a
Yes.
person. Okay, and that was really my question, Doctor. Is it, and from a layman's perspective, I'll ask it. Okay, in the sense that when we grow up in an environment like this, where it's okay, and we know these vile words, whatever they were, it's okay, right? We're used to it. That becomes our normal, does it not?
Well, that becomes the unconventional normal for that household. In other words, the ceiling level for quote-unquote normalcy is higher. There's a greater tolerance of improprieties or inappropriateness. An example of that would be, for example, a battered woman who maybe has her arm broken. And then she'll say, well, it wasn't that bad. Last year he broke my leg. So that there is an acceptance of that kind of abusive behaviors. For those of us that haven't experienced that, that doesn't make sense. But for those individuals that have lived in that kind of a household, you acclimate, you accustom. But when you go to school, then you start seeing that other kids aren't talking about that. Other kids don't describe their families that way. And so those are the shining lights that I think Mr. Alexander had, extended family. He was able to differentiate by writing about how abusive it was, and that he felt that abusiveness not only for himself, but for his siblings, so that he was aware that there was abusiveness there. But I'm not sure that Mr. Alexander was aware how that impacted him in terms of him being abusive to other individuals.
Well, let me ask you about that, because abuse and recognition, in order, I would postulate to you, in order for someone to say they're abusive, they must have to recognize what they're doing as abuse, don't they?
Not necessarily. By that I mean is if you grow up, I mean his descriptions of how when he says, I've never heard in any movie or on a street corner amongst the vilest of men any string of words so offensive and hateful. I mean, I think he's describing their severe levels of abuse. So if he doesn't, he's describing that, it has an impact on him. He grows up and he's engaging in other people. The way he engages in other people, as the way Ms. Hughes describes in terms of him being abusive to women, his concept of abuse may be that it's not like how my mother treated me. I'm not abusive. I'm not that bad. I may be rough around the edges, but I'm not abusive. So that he's experienced that. He's been a victim of abuse. He doesn't want to repeat that. He doesn't want to do that. But because of the impact of abuse, it affects us. It affects the children in terms of how they grow up and how they engage with other people. Are they as abusive as their parents? Oftentimes, no. Mr. Alexander came a long way in terms of being financially successful. There was a lot of self-correctedness that he did. You could see that he didn't want to be that abusive, but he was, because the abuse did have impact, but perhaps not to the level that he describes his mother.
So, Dr. Dennett, it seems what you're saying is that, he didn't want to be this way, but sometimes things could seep out because of this conditioning. Right? We have violence, we have name calling around this guy's life as a child. It is the normal.
Yes.
With love and intimate family relationships, right?
Yes.
Now, how does that, if you will, or if you can, how does that affect, how do these things, or how can they affect the intimate relationships? I mean, not just with siblings, not just with members of the family, but with women they're dating and interacting with, when we see some of the behavior, specifically talking about the behavior that the father, Mr. Alexander's father, and Mr. Alexander's mother engaged in. Axes and shooting cars and things of that nature. How does that start this love map that you talked about in this intimacy deficits?
Well, you start to think about, where do you learn about love? Where do you learn about bonding? Where do you learn about caring for other people? You learn it in your immediate family. That's the cornerstone. That's the beginning of that journey of learning how to love, how to be kind, how to be sensitive, how to be attentive, be aware of the other individual's needs, random acts of kindness. It doesn't appear that that was a normal staple in that home with his mother. So what did he learn? He learned violence, he learned about neglect, he learned about abuse. Does that mean that he's neglectful and abusive? Perhaps not to that degree, but there are some sediments of that seeps through into the psyche. If these are your role models, if this is where you're raised, if this is where you're living, and this is what's modeled to you in terms of how to love, how to be with one another, sees his mother and his father engaging in, I remember my mother emptying a revolver on my father, was driving, and my father subsequently taking an axe to my mother's belongings and destroying them. That's incredibly powerful for a child to see his mother and his father to be engaging in this intensity of violence. It has an impact. That you're doing this to the two people that are closest, mother and father, who created a family. This is the role model that he is seeing. So there's some intimacy deficits. There's a lack of kindness. There's lack of gentleness. There's lack of being sensitive. This is extreme on the other end. So to think that a child or children could be raised in a home that are exposed to this level and not come out having some impact, some scars, some residue is, I think, unrealistic. It has an impact. And he, I believe, from what he's describing here, he really picked himself up and improved who he was, where he came out of. I think that's what I can say about that.
Let me ask you a little bit about that. Because he had some, you talked about some positive influences in his life, didn't he?
He did. It was his great-grandfather
And
grandmother.
his great-grandfather actually said something to Travis that, again, I think he wanted to echo. Seems that based on the writing, he wanted to echo in his book. See this quote there? You are special, Travis. Don't ever forget it.
You're special, Travis. Don't ever forget it.
And that had a big impact on Mr. Alexander's life, didn't it?
It had a big impact, and he talks about that this is what he would hearken and listen to his great-grandfather. His great-grandfather would say to him when he was being abused. It was an anchor for him. That was an anchor for him.
And let me ask you this, Doug. I mean, based on the last sentence, he says, help me believe what is already true. He's writing this book because he wants everyone who's reading it to believe they're special.
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
What do the words say, Doctor?
That you are, help me believe it's already true that you are special. He's wanting to indicate.
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Let me ask you this, Doctor. Any reason that Travis's words wouldn't apply to Jodi Arias, the woman he loved?
Objection,
Yes.
speculation.
Overruled.
Judge, may we approach?
Yes, you may approach.
Doctor, in this passage to his book, Travis asserts, Mr. Alexander asserts that everyone on this planet is special in North Valley.
Yes.
And Doctor, as it relates to some of the things that we just saw in Exhibit 773, the intimacy deficits and things of that nature that we just spoke of, do we see a correlation between, do you see evidence, I guess, if you will, of these intimacy deficits when we're talking about the dialogue that Mr. Alexander is having with Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
And maybe we've already covered that, but I just want to make sure if you could sum up or clarify where exactly you see those.
Objection has been answered. Overall.
You see that in the emails where there's the theme of a lack of commitment, a lack of really sustaining of being with someone. And when Mr. Alexander talks about that he's come a long way in reference to his relationship separating out from Miss Reed and making room for Miss Arias. And then he says, I still have a long way to go. It's scary. It's scary for him to feel intimate, to be close. It's in his wordings. He's talking about that. And that's evidence for me.
Okay. Now, I want to go a little further as it relates to the history of Miss Arias. All right?
Yes, sir.
Can you speak up, please?
Yes, sir.
And her intimacy deficits, because she brought those to the table when they met in September 2006.
Yes, she did.
And while we don't have a book or any words necessarily written down in that kind of format, what do we know, what intimacy deficits do you believe that Jodi Arias brought to this relationship?
Objection, lack of foundation materials.
Sustained.
Based on everything you've reviewed, testimony, correct?
Yes.
You've reviewed her journals, correct?
Her journal entries, her testimony.
And you've reviewed a plethora of material, correct?
Voluminous.
And based on this review of these voluminous materials, you feel like you had adequate resources from which to talk about the intimacy deficits that Jodi Arias brought into this relationship.
Yes.
What intimacy deficits do you see in Jodi Arias, which she brought to the table in September 2000?
Well, it may not be perceived as an intimacy deficit, but how I see it is Miss Arias has a history of romantic relationships that were abusive.
Let's break that down a little bit.
Okay.
To your understanding, what is Miss Arias' first significant romantic relationship?
Her first significant romantic relationship was when she was a late teen, and that was with a fellow by the name of Bobby Juarez, Juarez. And in that relationship, he was abusive to her. He was physically abusive to her.
Well, let's talk a little bit more. Do you remember when this relationship began, at the age of Miss Arias?
She was approximately 17, 18.
And
She was in high school.
And to your knowledge, did Miss Arias finish high school?
She did not.
And did she? When did Miss Arias move out of the home?
Miss Arias moved out of the home when she was approximately 17, 18 years of age after an encounter with her parents.
And the encounter, what are we talking about?
From my recollection, Miss Arias was a teenager, was out with her friends the evening. I think came back late at night. And her father, apparently it was after curfew, a curfew that was set for her. She was asleep, and her father had, after she'd come in, she'd fallen asleep. Her father had come in and woken her up and asked where she was, and then slapped her across the face. And she fell back. And he was apparently asking many questions about where they had been, and then he put her on restriction for an extended period of time. She was about ready to graduate, I believe, or turn 18, and they were putting a number of restrictions on her for an almost young adult person. And the following day, I think it was, she packed her things and she left. And she didn't return till approximately 10 years later, 9 years later.
And yesterday we spoke about and a history of physical abuse from her father and her mother. Could you describe that, maybe just beginning with her mother?
Ms. Arias described a history of physical abuse by both of her natal parents, described that her mother would use a wooden spoon to hit her. She described one incident when they were traveling with the father in the car, and the mother and the father would basically take turns. That's my word, not necessarily Ms. Arias's word, to quote unquote discipline using a wooden spoon. Ms. Arias spoke about having welts from the physical abuse that had occurred over time and seemed to be more pronounced when she entered adolescence, that her mother and father were increasingly more physically abusive with them, using belt or a wooden spoon, the father pushing her, slapping her, knocking her into furniture. At one point, I think Ms. Arias hit her head and was knocked out, and the mother's response to that was, don't push her so hard, rather than maybe getting her to a physician and have her examined to see if there was something more serious with regard to that fall that she had taken.
Okay, so you mentioned this relationship with Father Juarez. Do you recall about how long that lasted?
It was a short-term relationship, less than 2 years, and it had an on and off period to it.
Okay. And you mentioned that there was abuse involved in that relationship.
Ms. Arias reported one time that he had choked her to the point that she had passed out, had twisted her arm where she felt he was almost going to break the arm.
But this is, so we're clear, this is based on Ms. Arias' report and her word alone, correct?
This is based on Ms. Arias' report.
And that same is true of her parents as well?
Yes.
What she says about her upbringing?
Yeah, the reports about her being abused as a child obviously comes from Ms. Arias.
What, to your knowledge, was her next relationship after Mr. Juarez?
I believe it was with a fellow by the name of Mr. Matt McCartney, I think is the last name. Forgive me, I can't remember the last name.
Okay.
His first name is Matt, I think.
Okay. In this relationship with Matt, what do you know about its dynamics?
I don't believe Ms. Arias necessarily described that relationship as abusive, but what she did find was that the gentleman had some infidelities and was cheating on her with another woman.
And how long a relationship was that?
I think that was approximately 2 years also.
And then yesterday we heard about her relationship with Mr. Brewer that directly preceded or was going on, as a matter of fact, when she met Mr. Alexander, correct? You recall talking about that?
Yes, Mr. Darrell Brewer. She was involved with him for a period of approximately 4 years.
So those we've covered now, these three individuals, not counting Mr. Alexander. This is the total of her relationship history at the point in time when she meets Mr. Alexander, correct?
Yes.
Now, we talked moments ago, we conceded the reality that as it relates to this history of abuse that Ms. Arias reported about her childhood and about Mr. Juarez, it was just her report. We have to concede that, right?
Yes.
Okay. But one of the things that you told us when you started out talking about those intimacy deficits that Jodi Arias brought to the table from her childhood.
Yes.
Do you see validation for those intimacy deficits in the history that she reported to you?
Yes.
Objection, vouching, validation.
Overruled.
Yes.
Could you describe those for us,
Well, Ms. Arias also reported that, or in the records that I read, that her natal father was very critical, debasing of her mother, putting the mother down, comparing the mother to other people, women in particular. And, you know, again, and that's the same thing that I was talking about earlier about when you're raised in a home, where do you learn about love? Where do you learn about kindness?
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
Well, this correlates, right? This is a description you're giving us, the correlation between this history and where she was at.
Yes.
So if you could continue explaining.
Then, as I was saying, is that, you know, a child, where does a child learn about love and kindness? In the home, with the parents. Miss Arias' mother apparently tolerated the maltreatment of Mr. Arias to her father. This is the role model in terms of what women do, how women interact with males. The mother was tolerant of the abuse, as reported by Miss Arias, by the father. That's the role model. And Miss Arias, in her relationships, as she reports it, with the other men in her life who were abusive to her, is not too dissimilar. That was modeled for her. So that there is a tolerance for abuse, and that it appears not to be objectionable to some degree. You saw that, for example, in the emails with Miss Sky Hughes to Mr. Alexander, when she's talking about that Miss Arias makes excuses for Mr. Alexander. Probably that generally comes from role modeling in terms of how you put together, how you tolerate the abuse. It may be that the mother had said to Miss Arias, you know, Dad's had a bad day, or it's not uncommon to hear that in cases of physical abuse, where there is some rationalization, some excuse for the behavior of abuse of an abusive father, for example.
So Doctor, part of what you're telling us then is when Travis Alexander walks over and sticks out his hand and introduces himself to Jodi Arias. In Travis, we have an individual who has a deficit, a psychology, a mindset where abuse is kind of relative, or it's an environment that he grew up in.
Yes.
And in Miss Arias, we have a similar thing, but on the other, in a similar, maybe a slightly different way, don't we?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
Yes, we do. It's very different. Miss Arias did not come out of a highly neglectful home like the early years for Mr. Alexander. I mean, Mr. Alexander talks about, you know, the neglect, the lack of food, cockroaches, having a phobia of roaches crawling on him because the home environment was so dirty and negligible that he experienced that. So the abuse that Mr. Alexander experienced was clearly different than the abuse that Miss Arias experienced. Nevertheless, they're both abuse.
And would it be your opinion to say that then when people like this, especially particularly Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias, there's somewhat of a bond that these people just engage in for whatever reason?
Yes.
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
Could you explain the reason why this can take place? These people with such abusive childhoods can have a tendency to just bond in such a powerful way.
Well, there's a commonality that they have, right? They're victims. They have a tolerance of that to some degree of abuse. They're tolerance level is higher than, say, someone who is not out of an abusive home for abusive behaviors. The first time, Ms. Arias describes that the first time she met Mr. Alexander, she describes he came right at me like an arrow, extending his hand and said, "Hi, I'm Travis Alexander," and introducing. That was very forward, very assertive of Mr. Alexander. And Ms. Arias coming out of a home where I gather from what I was able to read and in interviewing Ms. Arias that the father was abusive and the mother was somewhat passive. Ms. Arias is somewhat passive in terms of absorbing that. And so it may have been that when he came to her, Mr. Alexander came and extended a hand that very forward, Ms. Arias made a comment, it was just like a straight arrow. It may have been somewhat overwhelming for her. Well, overwhelming is probably not an appropriate word, but it was striking to her. It's the salient thing that when she describes the first time that she met Mr. Alexander, that's one of the things that she describes, is how forward he was. And I was noting more of her response being somewhat passive.
And doctor, so we have this relationship that begins in September 2006. We've documented some of the sexuality that took place and some of the tension that was taking place, at least in tension may be too strong a word, but in some of the dynamics that are going on in January 2007, as evidenced by the emails 5:15, 5:61.
Yes.
But there was also a positive, loving aspect of this relationship, wasn't there?
Yes, typically, it's not that the relationship is all abusive, right? You have to have some positive for that bonding to stick, to hang in there, right? So that's mixed in there with good times, doing things together, laughing, sharing positive things. So it's not always negative. That's what makes it so difficult, is that if I'm bonding with you and you're abusive with me, but you're periodically kind with me, I really want those positive experiences with you, right? We share some good things. We share some good times. That's one of the things that I think people who are in abusive relationships have difficulty separating, because it's not just all abuse. There's also good things that happen. And when there is abuse, there's generally apologies profusely. One feels contrite. One is remorseful. And it's not that it's fake. It really is a feeling sorry at that moment, a feeling bad, a being contrite. Ms. Arias talks about how Mr. Alexander would apologize, and he would genuinely feel bad. I don't think that was fake for Mr. Alexander. I think he genuinely felt bad when he was apologizing for his behaviors.
Doctor, let me talk about, you talked about some of those positive times, and maybe, I want to make sure we understand and can see evidence of what those are. So,
Yes.
I want to show you what's been marked for the 431. Is that something you saw before in your preparation for this case?
Yes, there were a number of pictures that I had seen that I viewed with Mr. Alexander and Ms. Arias, and Arias is a photographer, and I didn't see.
Objection beyond the scope of the question.
Sustained.
Well, let me ask you this. This took place in New Mexico, didn't it?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
I don't know exactly where it was taken, but I know that they had taken a number of small trips together for a number of different.
Sustained.
It was out of Arizona. It was out of where they could be seen by their peer group, wasn't it?
Stating that's an answer.
Sustained.
Let me show you what's been marked as Exhibit 432. You recognize that exhibit?
Yes, it's another picture of when they were traveling together, and generally those pictures I
Beyond
didn't.
the scope of the
So
question.
let me ask you this. Do you know where this.
Excuse me. I'm sorry, Your Honor. Mr. Martinez, I just cannot hear your objections. I just can't hear it. I'm sorry.
All right. Mr. Martinez, perhaps you could stand, and then that will alert the witness that you're
All right.
objecting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you know where this photograph was taken, Archer?
It is a valued place, a sacred place, I think, for Mormons. I don't know exactly the name of the place, but it's where they had traveled for a weekend.
To your understanding, or would you take equivalent with the issue that in prior testimony this picture was taken in a sacred Mormon spot in New York?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Yes.
Would you take issue with the idea that this was taken?
I would not take issue with that.
And likewise, would you take issue with the fact, if I told you that in prior testimony, in prior proceedings rather, that this photograph was identified as one that was taken in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the Albuquerque Balloon Festival?
Objection. Counsel is testifying. Asked and answered.
Counsel approach, please.
Doctor, showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 481. Do you recognize this exhibit?
Yes.
And who is with Mr. Alexander in this area, this venture?
Objection. Lack of foundation is clear knowledge.
Sustained.
Did you review this photograph as part of your preparation for this trial?
Yes, sir.
And in viewing the photograph and the testimony, you understand who the two individuals are standing next to Ms. Arias and Mr. Alexander?
The two individuals standing there are the Freemans.
Objection.
And who are the
Yeah,
Freemans?
hold on. Objection. Calls for yes or no.
Correct. Sustained.
Okay. Who's the man in the T-shirt there standing next to Ms. Arias?
Mr. Daniel Freeman.
And who's the woman right there standing next to Daniel Freeman?
His sister, Desiree.
What's her name?
Desiree
Desiree
Freeman. Siblings.
Dan and Desiree Freeman's siblings, friends of Mr. Alexander's, right?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Friends of Ms. Arias, right?
Yes.
And you reviewed the testimony, you reviewed the transcripts of the testimony of Dan and Desiree Freeman, did you not?
I did.
And showing. And in reviewing that testimony, you come to understand that, did you come to understand that Dan and Desiree had some particular insight into the relationship that Mr. Freeman and, that Ms. Arias and Mr. Alexander shared?
Yes, they did. Particularly Desiree, the sister.
Thank you, Doug. Judge, we need a few minutes to set up the FTR.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you could take a stretch break in place. It's going to take a few minutes, and so if you want to stand, I don't want you to leave the courtroom. It's 20 minutes until the lunch hour, so I don't want to send you out because I think it would take more time than we need to set up the equipment. But you are welcome to stand in place and stretch.
And the witness, right?
Kirk, what do you want to play first?
Desiree, which one?
Yeah.
front?
You may. Ladies and gentlemen, for planning purposes, we're going to take an abbreviated lunch hour today, 1 hour, because we are going to leave at 4 o'clock today. All right, so 1 hour lunch. So when we do leave, I'm going to ask that you return 1 hour later. Anyone have any issues with that? Anyone have any plans that would conflict with that schedule? Mr. Number, is there an exhibit number?
We'll obtain that.
And just before he plays it, I do want foundations, and if you want, we can appoint us to what foundation.
Yes. Approach.
It's late, Your Honor.
Approach. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, Exhibit 734 is going to be played for you. It is testimony from the trial of this case. The exhibit is not admitted. You will not have this disc in the jury room with you. This is just like any other testimony. So as you hear it, if you wish to take notes, you should do so. In addition, there are some bench conferences, and when those bench conferences do occur, the attorneys are going to attempt to fast forward through them. At a minimum, those bench conferences will be muted. All right? You may proceed.
Judge, I apologize, but we're having technical difficulties.
All right.
No sound.
Right.
All right, while we try to work out those difficulties, let's take the noon recess. Please be back in the jury deliberation room at 5 minutes to 1. 5 minutes to 1, and we'll try to start promptly at that time. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Have a nice lunch. You may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Are you Sam? Sorry about that. Checking your tracks.
Well, it's moving, but it's not going fast. It's not fast forward. Oh, yeah, it's a person.
And another phone.
Yeah, right.
Okay, I guess it's enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still not in
That's true. Let's see. Get any audio with that. Get anything to the
Yeah, see the judge and comments.
That's something that on my
Let's
computer.
check the end plug it and see, or does it not matter?
It shouldn't matter.
Because when it plugs into here, it's that we put on some audio program that came on this thing.